Yeah. Okay. So thanks very much. So as the chair said, I'm going to speak for a bit longer than was originally planned to speak. That's because I'm doing two sessions in one. I need to apologise slightly for the quality of the slides in the second half because I put them together when you went to lunch.
Very grateful.
But I suppose I'm talking about this in my capacity as I've been a PI for a clinical trial. As you said, I'm the director of the clinical research facility in Galway. So I've been involved in a lot of clinical trials, drug trials, medical devices, and also in non-regulated trials. And the principles that matter are common across them all. So for the first part where we talk about how to be an effective investigator, the first part of this I'm going to zip through relatively quickly, and that is based on what is defined in ICH-GCP as investigator responsibilities. So I have some gauge, has everybody done or be aware of what GCP is? So this is not brand new, that's good. The second part of it is not what's in GCP, and it's my perspective on having been at this over the last 10 years or so. And I'm happy to kind of, if I'm speaking too fast, I'm rambling, or somebody needs to tell me to move on, feel free. So ICH-GCP E6, the second revision from a couple of years ago, is quite specific about what the investigator responsibilities are. So this is predominantly applied for investigational medicinal product trials, so drug trials. It's generally applied for advanced therapy, ATMPs, which are stem cells or things like that. And most of the principles are common in ISO 14155, which is the version for clinical investigations, which are medical device trials. So the principles are common throughout them all. The first thing is, as the investigator, you are responsible for everything that happens at the site, or if you're the overall investigator for the trial, you're responsible for everything in the trial. End of, full stop. You are responsible. No matter what you think you might be able to delegate or ask somebody else to do for you, or things you don't really know how to do, you are still responsible. So if you say, I'm not a pharmacist, I don't know how to make up a study drug, I don't know how to store a drug, I don't know how to do all of those things, that's fine, you can delegate having a pharmacist involved, but you're responsible for ensuring the pharmacist is actually qualified, that the pharmacist actually knows what they're doing, and you're ultimately responsible for overseeing that. So the entire team that's involved in a clinical trial, you need to be satisfied is appropriately qualified between education, training and experience to do the work. And the competent authority, who's the regulator, so in Ireland that would be the HPRA, will look for that. They'll want written information of all of those things, and everybody needs to be trained as to what they're doing. So anything that's study specific is in the clinical trial protocol, might be an investigator brochure, maybe in a manual of operations, it's dealt with through a site initiation visit, all of those things. But the reason the investigator signs everything in a clinical trial is because they are responsible for it. So if somebody hands you a piece of paper to say, can you just sign that piece of paper to say the pharmacist knows what they're doing? If you choose to sign that without having asked a question or read the contents of it, that's on you. And the regulator will say to you, you should have read what you signed. Okay? For any of you who work at clinical trial sites, it's really common to hand a piece of paper to an investigator and say, can you just sign that? Can you sign this? Can you sign that? We need to do this, we need to do that. That's reasonable provided you're working with an investigator that's actually going to say, yeah, I know you know what you're doing, I'm confident with what's going on, I'm happy to sign off on this process, and they'll stand over it. How many of you are site level staff or would have worked at a site level or in a company but aren't the investigator? So the investigator is ultimately responsible. So even if they say, I didn't really read that, that's not your problem, it's theirs. So if any of you want to be an investigator, you do need to take this quite seriously. I'm not saying you need to turn into a micromanager who reads everything, who doesn't allow anybody to do anything, but you can't sit there and say, I just didn't know, because that's rubbish. From a resourcing perspective, there are some quite specific things need to be addressed. Because I'm now doing the second talk, I'm going to skip this slide. These are the principles that come from GCP, and I'm going to come back to it later on. So medical care for trial subjects is a really important one. So obviously this is relevant if we're doing a clinical trial of a drug or a device, right? Because if you're going to do a clinical trial of a drug or an ATMP like a stem cell, the legislation in this country requires it that the investigator is a physician. You can't do this if you're an allied health professional or a nurse or anything like that, right? Whether that's right or wrong is a different thing, but that is what it currently says in the literature. So the investigator is ultimately responsible for ensuring that the medical care of the trial subjects is adequate and appropriate throughout the trial. Right? You're primarily responsible for the trial-related care, not everything. So you're not turning into the person's GP for the 5 years they're in the trial, but you can't just say, oh, something happened to you, go to your GP. So there's a very fine balance between the two things. Can everybody hear me? Because it feels like this is coming and going a bit, but it's just my ears, I'd say. It's really important that anything that's trial-specific is addressed. Adverse events, which I'm going to talk about, because unfortunately you now have to listen to me give 3 talks this afternoon. I'll talk about them in a bit more detail later on. But you do need to also communicate with the person's GP or their primary physician to say, this person's in the trial, I'm looking after them. If effectively, how I view this is the person's GP or relevant clinicians need to know if something odd happens to the person during the study, they need to tell you. Because the GP's not going to know this. The other specialists in the hospital are not going to know this. Whatever healthcare professional somebody's attending is not going to know exactly what's going on in the trial if they're not directly part of it. The IRB is the Institutional Review Board or an ethics committee. They're really important. They have to have approved everything, in particular anything that is given directly to a subject or a participant in a clinical trial. So you're going to give somebody, I know you talked about consent and information leaflets, patient information leaflets this morning. If it's going to be physically handed to a participant or they're going to read it directly, it needs to go through the ethics or the IRB. Right? So if you're going to put a poster up to recruit somebody for a clinical trial, you're going to use social media, whatever strategy you're going to use, that stuff is really important. That has to go through the ethics. And predominantly that comes from the fact that you want to be sure that you're not misleading or coercing or scaring or doing anything else that might impact the general public. When you get sucked into being an investigator, or you're completely consumed at being site level and all you're interested in is getting patients into a trial, you often don't see what you would put in a poster, what you would put in a document. Depending on what you're doing, like if you're looking for healthy volunteers for a study, that's one thing, right? If you're looking for people with a particular condition, with a particular history, with anything like that, you can end up inadvertently triggering a whole lot of people and winding up down a whole avenue where it takes one person to be offended or complain about something, or go off on a tirade on social media. Appropriately or inappropriately, it doesn't matter. It still happens and it derails what you're trying to do. So most research centres, and we have it in ours and most of the other research facilities around the country, would have a process in place where if you're opening a clinical trial or you're implementing an amendment or an update to a clinical trial, there's a specific process you follow to ensure that the protocol and all the associated documents have been reviewed and approved by the IRB, by ethics. If it's relevant, that they've also been approved by the HPRA or whoever, and then they're implemented at site, just like you take away the old ones so that there can't be a mistake that's made. Protocol compliance is obviously really important. The whole point of doing the study is you want to try and standardise the delivery of care, right? So where this becomes a little bit messier is if you're an investigator who is, it doesn't really matter. If we say you're a non-physician who's an investigator in a non-regulated trial, so it's an entirely appropriate setup to do it, and you're dependent upon a physician delivering something as part of standard care, or you're dependent upon another health professional delivering something as part of standard care, and it's listed in the protocol, it is important that you can demonstrate that all of those things actually happened properly. Because if they don't, your study is a waste of time. Right? If you've got interventions and study processes that are not in any way standardised and are not compliant with the protocol, this is not about an ethics board coming back to you and saying, oh, you didn't dot that I properly. This is not about the HPRA walking into you and saying, you didn't follow that procedure. Both of those things are really important. But if you go back to the primary reason most people are investigators for clinical trials, it's because you have a question you're trying to answer, you're trying to improve the knowledge, you're trying to improve the care of patients, whatever the direction you're going in, you want to make sure that that's actually done properly. If, on the other hand, you're an investigator at a site level, right? So I'm talking about things at the minute now where if I come up with a clinical trial question, I get funding for it, I design the trial, I'm the primary chief investigator for the entire study, that's completely different to, there's a company in America who are running a trial around the world that have 400 sites, and you're just going to be one of them. And you're the investigator who's going to say, oh, I'm just going to have to do this. I've had no real input into the question, I've had no real input into the design of anything, I just need to execute it. The protocol for all intents and purposes, is effectively a Bible, and you need to try to stick to it. And any time there's a deviation, you need to be clear on saying why that actually happened. There are circumstances where you can implement a deviation from a protocol, and that is if you absolutely have to protect the safety of a participant in the short term. But otherwise, deviations or variations from a protocol should be minimised, and you certainly shouldn't be changing things until they've been appropriately approved and documented and gone through the process. Investigational products or investigational medicinal products is the legal term for a study drug. So as I said earlier, the investigator is responsible for ensuring that there is what's called accountability of the study drug. You don't have to do every step of the accountability yourself, but you have to be satisfied that you have a team to do this. So that means, if you have a pharmacy, you have a pharmacist, or you have a person who is going to take responsibility for the study drug, you can delegate it to them provided they're adequately trained. This is not saying every single study drug has to be kept in a pharmacy. It is entirely appropriate that it's kept in a locked cabinet in a place with restricted access, with appropriate temperature controls, or whatever is dictated in the protocol for the drug. But you do need to be satisfied that people are tracking what's going on. So if you get 200 pots of study drug in the door, you need to be able to say, we've received this from the courier. It was fine when it came from the courier. There were no quality issues. We kept it in this place. We're monitoring the expiration dates. We know what we gave to each person. We took the bottles back at the end of the study, we discarded it, and we can track it the whole way through. That's why this matters, because you don't want investigational drugs getting into, I hate using this phrase, but getting into the wrong hands or being given to somebody who shouldn't get them. Right? And it's particularly important from a safety of the public perspective. Right? If you look at it and say, from most patients in a clinical trial, if we assume it's being done properly and in line with GCP, are really well protected and well monitored by the study staff, by the investigators, by everybody involved, and the patient knows what's going on. But if somebody inadvertently gives a bottle of a medication to somebody who didn't know what was in it, or they thought it was something else, I'm not saying this will be done vindictively. If you just happen to have 300 bottles of medication in a room, and you thought you picked one up off the first shelf and you actually picked it up off the second shelf, you could end up giving somebody a bottle of medication that contains something they're allergic to, they have a catastrophic reaction to, whatever. Randomization is randomization. I don't know, Declan may talk a bit about some of that in the design section, but the point of this is it's one of the biggest pillars of scientific integrity of clinical trials. Obviously, this is only relevant to the randomized trials, but you need to follow the procedure properly. There is a possibility to, in a blinded study, to be able to unblind somebody. So you all know what blinding is, where the investigator or the patient or somebody doesn't know what's going on. If it's really relevant to the clinical care of the patient in an emergency, it is possible to do that. As an investigator, it should be going through you, and you should be trying to minimize as much of that happens, right? So that's not a case of a clinical trial patient ends up in the emergency department not feeling very well, and the SHO or whoever sees the patient says, oh, they're in a trial, I'd love to know whether they're getting the active drug or not. That's not a valid reason for unblinding, in my view. If you're concerned the drug might have caused something, like we had an example of a study we did where there was an anticoagulant being given to a patient, and the protocol stipulated that if a patient came in from the clinical trial and they were bleeding, they were to be given fresh frozen plasma and blah, 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 blah. Standard protocol. Didn't matter whether they were in the study or not. So the investigator, sponsor, and the entire team in that circumstance would say, just because the patient is bleeding, we're not unblinding, because the standard of care is the same for both groups. Whereas if you had to say, I do need to know whether I give you or don't give you a specific antidote, you do need to unblind. I imagine you've covered consent before this morning, talking about information leaflets and the contents of that. So in the interest of time, I'm not going to spend too long talking about it, just to say that GCP is incredibly specific on what clinical trial consent needs to include, all of the different phases to it, all of the things the participant needs to be told and not told. The other one to bring up are records and reports. So GCP says that you should have all of these statements. I've adapted all of these slides directly from GCP itself. So if you're going to complete a measurement, collect information, do anything to a patient in a clinical trial, you need to be able to verify that that is what you actually did. So there are source data documents, and most clinical trials and most sites will define what a clinical source or what a source document is. So source data is effectively the first time you collect the piece of information, it should be documented in a particular place. So if what you're doing is you're bringing a patient into a clinical trial visit, they're only coming into the hospital to see you for your clinical trial visit. They're not coming in for any other reason. And you have to take their blood pressure, for example. You're going to have either a direct electronic entry if you've got the appropriate type of data system, or you're going to have study-specific documentation you're maintaining to say, this person came into me today, I took their blood pressure and it was 130/70. Such that when a monitor or anybody from the sponsor or anybody else wants to go back and say, in the database that's in that somebody's blood pressure is 130/170, like, that's not plausible what happened there, and the simple answer is somebody made a typo in the data system, you can go back to your source document and say, it's actually 70, we can correct it. So you have to have records for that. If you're then going to say, I need to collect information on a patient who was hospitalized with a heart attack, you had nothing to do with the care of the patient with a heart attack because it happened through standard of care or it happened in a different hospital to where you work in. The source data for that event is the documentation you can get for the heart attack. So be that a discharge letter, be that medical records, be it a medical chart, a lab test, whatever. Everything has to have an audit trail. Everything has to be clear. There's a principle called ALCOAC when it comes to documentation around whether things are attributable, legible, whether you can maintain an audit trail. All of those things, they're incredibly important principles to be there. And then safety reporting, obviously, there's a slight spoiler. I'm talking about safety reporting later on. So again, I'm going to skip this a little bit. Trials can sometimes stop early, right? So a sponsor may choose to stop a study because they've a data safety monitoring board say your study's achieving nothing or your study's amazing. At site level, you won't know the answer to that question at the time. You'll just know there's been a decision made to stop the study. If that happens, as the investigator, you're responsible for ensuring that everybody who's in the study knows the study stopping early and you plan for how they're going to exit the study. It becomes really important if you've somebody, I always think of oncology when we do this for some reason, but in cancer trials, a lot of patients are only getting access to investigational experimental treatments they may be gaining benefit from that aren't available through any other channel. So when a study like that stops, some companies or some entities will say we're going to continue to make the drug available as part of compassionate use, we're going to make the drug available through some other channel, but that might be very different if you're running a study of primary prevention where the drug is not available but it's still a primary prevention agent. So you need to follow what the sponsor is telling you to do. The chief investigator for a study can choose to stop a trial independent of the sponsor, or the ethics board or your infrastructure may say we're stopping your trial. So for example, I try and keep this as abstract as I can make it. As the director of the CRF in Galway, if I think that one of the studies is not being done properly, institutionally I can make a decision to say, you're making a mess of this. Obviously I'm paraphrasing a small bit because I'm trying to be nice. You're not protecting your patients properly. There's issues with the procedures. We need to pause recruitment in your study until this is sorted out. If a monitor, an external person comes in for a clinical trial, says these are problematic areas, this needs to be addressed, you may be paused, right? All of those sorts of mechanisms can come into play. So what you want to be clear on here is, if I make the decision as the director of the CRF that I'm not letting Declan run his clinical trial, not that I'd ever do that with Declan. I know. I'll have to tell Declan, but I will also have to tell our institution I've made that decision. And between Declan and I, it's the responsibility to tell the sponsor that we're pausing for whatever reason. So studies can stop for lots of different reasons. So I'm trying to watch where I am time-wise. So what I'm going to try and move into is a little bit more on the practical, what I would call the not forget GCP, but let's not get as bogged down in GCP terminology and look about the practicalities and the reality of being an investigator. So the first thing to say is usually the investigator is supposed to be the leader and the content expert for the scientific question. Right? So if you look at this from a clinical perspective, somebody's designing a clinical trial, an investigator should be an expert in the care of the condition that they're doing the trial on. So there's a colleague of ours in Galway doing a study on a use of a drug for the treatment of gestational diabetes mellitus. She's the chief investigator, it's a regulated trial, it's funded by the HRB, it goes through HPRA, it goes through ethics, it goes through everything else. She is a content expert in gestational diabetes. And she should be. That's what the investigator should be. That's not the same thing as saying you're a content expert in trial methodology. Most clinicians are terrible at it. brutal, right? And they all think they're extra special. I'm saying this as a clinician as well, and I'm the one who's often the one butting heads here, but the reality is that the investigator may not actually be an expert in methodology. They may not be an expert in GCP. I'd nearly say they're almost certainly not an expert in GCP, and they may not get why this is important. So it's really important as an investigator that when you're designing a trial, you collate a team around you and you actually listen to what they're telling you. Not somebody tells you something you don't like the answer to and say, well, I'm a doctor, I don't like being told no, so I'm just going to do it anyway. That's not going to wash in my eyes, and it's incredibly disrespectful. The other thing is you need to think through the practicality and the logistics of doing the clinical trial. HRB and others are very much into public and patient involvement in clinical trials. I would agree with the importance of public and patient involvement in clinical trials, but people also need to look at the logistics of a clinical trial. So I would say if you're the investigator, you're part of a clinical team, you need to look and say, if I was a patient being asked to go into this clinical trial, would I do this? How much of my time is this going to take? How much hassle is this going to be? What benefit am I going to get out of it? What risk is there? But literally think through, I can't come in here. So for example, in that gestational diabetes trial, the visits for that study are set up every 2 weeks. How many of you have children? Right, so if you had a 6-week-old baby, would you be happy to go into the hospital for a 2-week visit? So the laughter answers the question, right? So you have to look and say, well, at that point in time, we're not actually doing 2-week visits. We're going to see you at 12 weeks. You're like, that makes sense. But during the pregnancy, because you're slightly higher risk, you actually are going into the hospital for 2 weeks or every 4 weeks. So we're going to align your care for the clinical trial to what's going on in reality. That makes things far more acceptable to a person. It's important as an investigator to listen to somebody who works at a site level. They know how this is actually going to run. They know how this is not going to run. When you think that you can say, oh, it's great, I'm going to consent 10 patients every week. Okay. So week 1, you've got 10 patients. Week 2, you've now got 20 patients. Week 3, you've got 30 patients. They're all coming in for follow-up visits really frequently. The clinic's going to explode in about a month. Nobody's going to get what they're supposed to be doing, and the whole thing's going to fall apart. Most investigators don't see it that way. Site staff see it that way because they look at this and say, that's not going to work. That's not going to be a problem. We don't have the staff to do that. We've had discussions with people where they say, oh, we've only got 20 patients in the study. And it's like, that's fine, but all 20 of them come in for an appointment between 9 and 11 on a Wednesday morning. That's not 20 patients being spread out across 3 days or 4 days or 5 days. So if you don't see that, you're not anticipating where the bottlenecks are going to occur. I've already said this about responsibility. The investigator is ultimately responsible for everything. Delegation doesn't absolve you of anything at all. That doesn't mean you're responsible if one of your staff goes completely and utterly rogue, right? People do that. They'll deviate from procedures. They'll do whatever they feel like. They'll do what they want on the day. What you need to be confident is, I picked that person to work for me because they have the training, the expertise. I've trained them on what's going on. We've documented. They've got the support of the facility and the entity. You need to own the responsibility of being an investigator. It is incredibly frustrating for me, for competent authorities like the regulator, for ethics boards, for anybody, to sit and listen to an investigator blame their site staff for something, blame the pharmacy, blame the hospital, blame somebody else for everything else. It doesn't work, right? It has to be respectful. It has to be, yes, this happened, we need to try and move on and we need to improve things a little bit. There's a very fine balance to be struck between micromanaging the research staff and having appropriate oversight. People do have very valuable skill sets. They are incredibly well qualified to do specific things. They should be doing things within the scope of their practice. You should be overseeing the scope of their practice, but you don't come in to say, I have a nurse who's working in cardiology trials for 20 years. I don't need to walk in and make sure she can take a blood pressure properly. But I do need to read what the blood pressure value was, because that nurse, who's not a nurse prescriber, isn't the one who's qualified to say, well, how are we going to deal with the fact that that blood pressure is 200 over 170? That's the difference. I've talked a little bit, I know I'm overlapping a little bit here. You do need to have the right skill set to execute the clinical trial. So if we park site level studies for a second, because this has a bit more in it. So at site level, it's often research nurse, research assistant, research associate. If you have a physio, if you have a nurse, if you have an OT, whatever the intervention or the study's involved, you're executing what's described by the protocol and you have to deliver what's there. If you're the chief investigator, you're designing the study and you're doing everything. So I know I keep harping on about this gestational diabetes trial, but it's the handiest one to describe. That study was designed in Galway, the scientific question was in Galway, and every single aspect of that procedure, of that study, happens in Galway. So we've done the data management, we've built the database, we've done all the study procedures. So everything the site does, a different part of our team has designed it. The investigator will happily tell you herself she hasn't a clue what most of those people spend their time doing, because she does not know how to do their job. The most important thing in that sentence is she doesn't know how to do their job, but she does know that their job is important. If you don't respect those people, your study is screwed. So you need to know who needs to be involved in the study. So if you're doing a regulated drug trial, you need to have a data management team. You need to have a database that meets specific requirements. You have to have audit trails. You have to have pharmacovigilance. You have to have blah, 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 blah. If you're doing a non-regulated clinical trial, you don't need necessarily all of those things, but you still want to include them to best practice. Road testing and piloting any process is really important. So do you all know what case report forms are? So the sheets or the templates that we use to collect data in clinical trials, it's really important if you get them, and particularly as the chief investigator, that you try and fill one out. I don't mean look at it and say, oh yeah, that looks great. I mean actually fill it out based on reality, right? Because we've had examples where case report forms have gone out where somebody in data management designed a form, you'll know what I'm talking about, but anyway, they designed a form that included a lab test result. They Googled the lab test to say, well, what unit is that kept in? What's the normal range? What's happening? They took the American ones. We don't use the American ones. So that can be off by so I'm a nephrologist. This is not what I'm talking about. But for example, in North America, creatinine is measured in milligrams and you get a value of 1. That 1 in our units is 88. Right, so we don't need a decimal point here. You do need a decimal point if you're taking North American. So literally that sort of stuff that's there. So you do need to be able to do that. Things are never going to go according to what you expect, ever. So you need to actually kind of say, well, why did that happen that way? You need to be open to change and to be able to operate within the guidance of GCP and within the guidance of the protocol and everything that matters. It's very important, in my view, when an issue occurs to look at why we think the issue occurred without blaming anybody. So I say this to our coordination team all the time. They'll say, I can't believe the site did this. And you're like, why did the site do that? Why do you think they thought that was the right thing to report? Right? I'm not saying people don't make mistakes, and I'm not saying people don't go rogue. But generally speaking, most people are not trying to make their life more difficult. Their own life more difficult. Like if you're at site and you enter a whole load of crap into a database, you're going to have to fix it. Right? You're going to have to go back through processes to fix it. It's going to take you 3 times the length of time it would have taken you to do it properly in the first place. So very rarely do people want to actually make a mistake. So this comes up a lot in data management where you send a query to a site to say, you've answered this question this way. It's not right. You know, the site are going to go, okay, but what were you actually looking for, right? You could have a process that's wrong. You could have a filter that's wrong. So you need to think through and say, is this reasonable? If the site genuinely made a mistake, they made a mistake, but it is actually possible, and most investigators forget this, that you might have made the mistake, that the coordination team might have made the mistake, the data management team might have made the mistake. So you have to be open to do this and not be aggressive. The other practical thing is, if you're an investigator or a site team at a coordination thing, so including people who are working in industry and CROs, and you get really difficult with the site team, what will a site team do? They're not going to help you. They're not going to go out of the way to do things. So if you have a bad relationship, they're not going to do anything that's going to harm the patient, but they're going to make you wait for things, and they're not going to help. Right. And I'm not suggesting that's vindictive. It's entirely appropriate. If somebody's being an asshole to you, you're going to be the same way back. So, and it's going to delay everything. Legislation, requirements and standards. The top line is, I've already said this, right? So investigators are not actually that special. The rules are the rules and they apply to everybody. There are times you can bend the rules. There are times you can try and work around them. It does require you to actually know the rules in order to do that. Not just, oh, I don't like that sounds more complicated. Why is it going to take me 3 months to get something back from the HPRA? Surely I could just do it myself. Best one I hear, and I've heard it repeatedly, is an investigator doesn't want to wait for the university to make a decision as to whether they're going to sponsor a clinical trial. And they're just going to sponsor it themselves. Because they don't know what that means. They forget that the regulator does. So respect is a really important one, right? And I see this this comes up as an issue far more than it should, right? Investigators, on average, are not the best at respecting their site staff. They're not the best at respecting their general study team. Right, that's not every investigator. I'm thinking of specific people right now who I would very happily remove from the institution and never have to work with them again. And I'm not the one having to listen to them all day, every day. People do know what they're doing. People do have a skill set. People have a perspective. If you don't value them, it's going to cause a problem. I spent a lot of time in McMaster working on clinical trials, and the head program manager, who's an administrator, who is an expert in GCP, who's been doing very large cardiovascular clinical trials for 25 years, would walk into the room and speak to the investigators and say, that's not going to work because GCP says this, or the privacy legislation says this, or the import issue in that country says X, right? Because I imagine most of you are thinking of doing clinical trial in Ireland. If you want to try and do an international one, importing product and everything is a whole other nightmare. But they do know all that stuff. And the investigator goes, oh, that sounds more complicated than it should be. And she literally said, it is. If you want to ignore me, I will visit you in jail. Right? Investigators forget that if you make a serious mess up in this space, you can lose your medical license, which means you lose your career. At its most extreme end, you can be prosecuted through all of this stuff. This is not trivial. And as I said earlier, people generally are trying to do the right thing. I have also sat there with people who are telling me it's going to take, in one recent example, 20 days to do a particular process that I did in 6 hours. I understand I'm not representative of everybody, but the 20 days was ridiculous. And I knew it was ridiculous because I do actually know how to do that person's job, because I've done that person's job at another point in time when I was a trainee. So you do need to be able to push people at times when it sounds like they're being difficult for the sake of being difficult. But you also need to respect them when they're pushing you. That principle is the same when it comes to responding to challenges and problems. That one in blue, the second last one here, is how you behave when you hear the answer that you want versus the answer that you don't want. Full disclosure, I don't have children, but this is what I see people's children doing. Mammy didn't give me the answer I quite liked, so I'm going to go to Daddy and see if he gives me the one I want. That sort of thing. The investigators are basically toddlers when it comes to this particular part of the process. So it is important to look at this and go, there are times when I need to actually question that decision. There are times when I don't. If you go rogue, it's going to be completely inefficient. The other thing is infrastructure and the ecosystem. Now, I'm obviously saying this in my capacity as the director of the CRF, right? So do you all know what the CRFs are? Do any of you not know what this is? So for anyone who doesn't, right, there are clinical research facilities or clinical research centres around the country. So there's 7 or 8 of them, right? They're in most of the larger universities or affiliated with the universities and the university hospitals. They were set up to provide the infrastructure, the space and the expertise necessary to execute clinical trials. So in ours, just like it's mirrored across all of the rest of them, we have a quality management system. We have all the procedures and processes that you need for clinical trials. We know what you need to do to get something through ethics. We know what you need to do to get something through the regulator. We know how you need to train people. We have template documents for everything you can imagine, because we've been at these clinical trials since 2010 in this particular system, and the hospital was doing it before. The centres around the country do actually talk to each other, maybe less so now than they did when they were set up, but they all shared practices. So the infrastructure does know how to do this properly, within reason. So you don't need to reinvent the wheel every single time. We're here at TMRN. If you're an investigator and you're putting a grant in, TMRN are really important to help with designing your clinical trial, deciding if you can include SWOTs, do other things. There is the public and patient involvement infrastructure that exists is there for a reason. The National Clinical Trials Office is there for a reason. If you were looking at Evidence Synthesis Ireland for trying to get your systematic review done, that's there for a reason. You don't need to reinvent the wheel every time. So it's really important to learn what's available to you locally and what's available to you nationally. What you might be able to achieve and get access to without having to pay for it. Right, and I'm saying this from the perspective of you're an academic investigator who's trying to set up a study, not somebody who's in an industry company or somebody who's trying to generate a spin-out who's going to make themselves a fortune. A lot of the infrastructure is designed to try to enable investigators to be as good as they can possibly be and remove the barriers. So people can come to us and say, I have an idea for a clinical trial, I haven't a clue how to do a trial. We'll say to them, well, you need an idea, you need the bare bones of a protocol. I know you don't know what 3/4 of the protocol means, but the bits that you do know are these ones. Put this together and tell us what you want. We can work with you and we say, you need the public and patient involvement, go talk to PPI Ignite. You want to get sites around the country, talk to the clinical trials office. You want to include methodology research or do something interesting in there, go talk to TMRN, and so on. Rather than you have to say, I'm the first person who's ever thought about doing a research methodology question. You're not, right? Just like a lot of investigators think they're the first person who's ever come up with that question because they might not be able to do a systematic review properly or do a literature review. I know I'm not supposed to say that out loud, but that's the truth. That's the truth. The other thing to say, and this is a bugbear of mine, it's not going to work if you're coming up with a clinical trial. You've written a grant application. You want my infrastructure or any infrastructure to support you in your clinical trial, and you come to us at 10 o'clock the night before the grant is due. Because odds are, unless you're actually somebody who's been doing this for a very long time, you won't have a clue what you're actually planning to do. You'll have forgotten a whole series of things, and you won't also have addressed anything that makes sense. So I'm going to move into resourcing for the last 5 minutes I have here. So I've already talked about participant recruitment. The most important, do any of you know what this reference is, or are you all too young? The dreams reality thing. It's for the TED. So the rest of you might have to Google that, but anyway. If you're going to run a clinical trial, right, and you're going to run it with industry in particular, right, industry pay you based on the number of people you've recruited into your clinical trial. They pay you per completed case report form, they pay you per completed process. If you know that the study is going to cost you 30 grand to run, you're going to get 10 grand per patient. You need to actually achieve 3 patients in the study to break even, and after that, to generate additional resource, you need to have a couple of extra patients. If in reality what happens is you recruit 1, the cost is still going to be 30 grand realistically, because all the staff and all the effort and all the hassle comes into it. You're going to lose a fortune from that. Time is really important. I've already talked about it from here. Staffing, I've talked about a little bit as well, and I've given my rant and rave about the infrastructure and making sure that you actually connect with it. Supervision and oversight is really important. So it's important, and I'm going to come back to this with the safety events later on. There are things that you can decide as an investigator that are not important, that you think don't matter, that are not clinically significant, that you're never going to tell anybody about. You actually need to write that down. You need to say, I've reviewed this situation and I don't think this is clinically relevant or overly important. I don't think it's anything I'm worried about, and this is why I've not done it, and you've written it down. If, on the other hand, what happens is you go through a monitoring visit or a competent authority inspection and someone says, that person had pneumonia, why did you not report that as an adverse event? Oh, I don't know. Because the rule in this space is if it's not written down, it didn't happen. External parties are a really important one. So if you're going to engage any outside entity to conduct something for you, you're still responsible for ensuring that they did it properly. So one of the classic examples I give here is, for us, it is impossible for us to get a patient into a CT scanner or an MRI for a research scan in the public system within the timeline and the windows specified by the clinical trial protocol. We just can't do it. So what we do is we actually procure and use the services of some of the private imaging centres that are nearby that the sponsors pay for. In order for us to do that, we have to have an agreement with the external entity to say, you're going to do this for us, and this is what the protocol requires, and we're satisfied that you're going to be able to do this because they're an appropriate vendor. It might be the same when it comes to bloods, it might be the same to something else, and if you're a chief investigator running this at the university level, you might be outsourcing your data management practices, you might be outsourcing your monitoring. You still need to check and have a system in place to ensure that your subcontractors are able to do what they're supposed to. I'm conscious of the fact that most of you probably don't deal with budgets, or do any of you deal with budgets? Okay, so there's a couple of you do deal with budgets, right? So the first thing I'd say is there are costing templates for clinical trials. They're really hard they're not hard to use, it's quite hard to guess exactly what's going to be required for a clinical trial. For staff in particular, the cost of a staff member for most entities, particularly in the university, is their salary, plus their PRSI, plus their pension, plus thinking about if they're going to end up on sick leave, unpaid leave, where their annual leave is going to go, how they're going to be covered in it, and my personal favourite is maternity leave. Because every institution will pay the person who's on maternity leave. They may not replace the person who's on maternity leave. That's a nightmare if you are in a clinical trial where your research nurse or your research assistant or your investigator goes on maternity leave and they're not there. So it's really important to factor that in and know your local setup. So if your institution is happy to support it, it's not a problem. If your institution doesn't support it, it is. So HRB will pay maternity leave, or they certainly used to pay maternity leave. Industry won't. Non-staff, again, I've covered some of this sort of stuff already, and I know I'm about to run out of time, so it's worth knowing what is available to you. I'm not going to say for free because somebody is paying for it, but if the institution is willing to say, well, we're going to allow you the time of a statistician, or we're going to allow you the time of this or that, you don't have to include it in your budget. You need to know what consumables you need. Other than the people who deal with budgets, do any of you know what procurement is? It's a nightmare. Nightmare. Right, and that's all I'm going to say about it, is it's an absolute nightmare. So it's important to not underestimate how complicated those things are. Overhead is a bugbear and usually triggers most academic people because each institution takes it differently. So when you're trying to get your costs, the institution's going to want to take an overhead. If you're doing a study for industry, for example, there are state aid rules, so if the university is going to execute a study for a purely industry profit-making company, there are legal requirements as to how much money the university needs to charge the company for that. So just all I'm saying is don't underestimate that. So overall I've zipped through a whole lot of stuff, and I hope to God I haven't confused everybody. But just to be clear, from an investigator's perspective, you are responsible for everything. You need to ensure that people know what they're doing. People can be appropriately delegated tasks. It's worth knowing what your break-even point is and being grounded in reality, not in delusion around the number of patients you might be able to get in. Having the time to do this, be willing to actually oversee people and know what the financial components are. Because if you run a study where you don't have the resources, you don't have the training, the study can have a critical finding. Right? A critical finding means that harm did or could have occurred to a patient. That can shut you down as an investigator. You could lose your license. It could impact your institution locally or nationally. So that it has a massive impact. So there's the patient impact, obviously I'm not trivializing that, but the impact on everybody else is also very significant. I'll stop rambling now and you'll have a break from me until I come back to talk about safety reports.